Um, how would you introduce yourself? I find that such a fun kind of philosophical
Yeah,
question. I guess it's like how one would do such a thing.
on a personal level, I'd say I'm just sort of uh, perhaps an amateur student of history and philosophy, uh, and I also enjoy just trying to think of what else to say. But basically, I'm someone who just really enjoys reading about, especially like I said, political economy, history, philosophy. Um, I'm a very tiny smidgen spiritual, and I would say that in terms of my thought, and that would be sort of where I'm coming from. Of course, that doesn't tell you much specifically, but yeah, that's those are sort of the topics that I'm interested
I love
in
that.
terms of me. So yeah,
It's like a neat kind of framework, and obviously we'll discuss. I've done some reading up on the list of thinkers that you've shared, and some of which I'm like, why have I never read this? What's wrong with me? Um, but if I may, I the way I sort of think of you is perhaps the or one of the ways is perhaps like the most well read person I've ever known. Um, I don't like if I wanted to ask somebody about like what kind of like the Amazon of like book reviews. I sort of think of you in that vein. It's just the Library of Alexandria. Welcome back, Alexander. Um, of sort of just incredible breadth and depth of knowledge on so many subjects, and
well,
um, I also think you were an absolute expert at sort of being as minimizing your own bias as much as possible, and just really having a kind of like fundamentally open mind, which
oh
is
well, thank you. That's
pretty
quite kind.
pretty sick. I think it is. I think it is fair, as far as I can tell. Um, Tight. I also would say like I think you are a amateur. Are you kidding me? You're the expert. I think many experts are sophists. Ooh, shots fired.
Oh man,
They're fakeries. They're
academia is
phonies.
shaking.
Academia is shaking, and as well as well, you mentioned
They've
political and
been destroyed
economic
by
theory.
facts and logic. Yeah.
Yeah,
Just-
delightful. So let's get into less about the framework of Alex Miller and more into who do you like? Who do you have a crush on? Wait, no, you're married. Um, but philosophers, thinkers, that you find compelling.
Sure. And there's so many I could obviously touch
Mm-hmm.
on. Um, but if you kind of want kind of there's sort of some of the notes I sent you contain some of
Yeah.
them. Probably one of my favorites is in terms of Eastern philosophy is going to be Lao Tzu and Alan Watts as well. I also like David Loy. I'm a big fan of. He systematizes a lot of Eastern philosophy
Hmm.
in ways that are very helpful. He focuses on, of course, on Zen Buddhism and the idea of non-duality.
Huh.
Um, and then I also talked a little bit about David Darling. David Darling is interesting. He's sort of like I read up on his background a bit before, but he mainly is interested in usually traditionally Western topics, but he also dabbles a little bit because his book is called Zen Physics, right? And so he talks a little bit about Buddhism and also about things like mathematics and physics in it.
Wow.
So it's very interesting.
So you said a phrase which has not ever clicked in my mind before, but Buddhism and non-duality. What does that mean? What does
That's
that
a
look like?
great question to start with, for sure. I would say that so Buddhism, a lot depends on which school you're in.
Hmm.
So if we're just talking about traditionalist, very traditional Buddhism, the kind that you would be at home with, perhaps in worship places in Japan and elsewhere.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of sort of, I'm trying to remember the name, but there's so a very traditional look at Buddhism would be basically that the root of suffering uh, is attachment, and that um, the cycle in life and death is to be escaped
Hmm.
via enlightenment, um, and that and then enlightenment and the end of um, suffering is sometimes described as almost like a candle or a flame being put out,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And it's supposed to end the because of course part of the traditional Buddhism would be, and I use the word traditional very cautiously because
Sure.
there are different traditions. Um, I'm just blanking on the names because of course I would.
Of course. Of course.
Um, but
It's only fair.
in any case, so the explanation would be you're reincarnated based on karma from a past life, and then the goal is to escape the cycle of suffering, um, and suffering takes both place within life and with also in the fact that you have to keep being reborn over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's one vision of Buddhism. Um, but there's also Zen Buddhism, which is quite different, which focuses there's a lot to say about Zen Buddhism, and there are thinkers that disagree. So some prominent Zen Buddhist figures are like Bodhidharma, uh, Dogen, um, Huangbo. There are some others as well,
Hmm.
but one of the parts of Zen Buddhism that I really like is they focus on it's sort of an anti-conceptual focus, and you can find this going way back historically. Some people have thought that it's new, but it's not. You can find it in older writings, but the idea that much of the suffering and anxiety we have is due to basically us projecting concepts and categories onto a world that resists them. Um, so if you,
Hmm.
so for instance, I don't know if you've ever meditated, but a big part of Zen Buddhism is called empty mind meditation. And what that is basically where you meditate and you empty your mind. And it's really simple, but it also, when you do empty mind meditation, um, it it's basically, since you empty your mind, you stop, you stop conceptualizing, and you stop basically your thoughts from running wild all the time.
Hmm.
And in that, there's not only remarkable peace, but you kind of get a better look at the world as it is. Um, like I remember whenever I did empty mind meditation, I sort of got up from it and just kind of looked around, and things definitely seemed a lot different when I sort of quieted down the 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 analytic and conceptualizing mind, right?
Hmm.
Um, so a lot of Zen Buddhism is sort of this anti-conceptual focus of sort of seeing the world without human projections on it, because we normally sort of impose this grid of thought on a world that doesn't really fit,
Wow.
right? Yeah.
Wow.
Um,
That's
so
actually so compelling.
it is, um, and so that's Zen. So there's Mahayana. There's one other which Theravada's. There it is. There's the word. Theravada is
Nice.
the traditional school of
You
Buddhism.
Googled it. We
Mahayana.
all know.
No,
Cheater.
dang. But no, I just remembered it. Because Theravada is the more traditional one, so to speak. Mahayana was a little bit newer, and Zen is part of the Mahayana school. Um, there's so much nuance to also talk about, but
Hmm.
Buddhism also just has a lot of great advice on how to live. So like how to approach a basic situation with mindful awareness, how to um, basically having compassion for all beings, things like that. Like it's really good stuff.
Hmm.
Even if like I don't agree with everything in Buddhism, but it certainly has a lot to offer. So
Well, I'd like to pick up on a few things. One of which, as you know, also love philosophy, but I'm a sucker for our mustachioed friend Friedrich Nietzsche. Not so
Yeah.
much to like agree with everything he says, but to sort of I find so much of his ideas immensely exciting jumping off points. And
Yeah.
one of those is the eternal recurrence. To where the classic kind of example goes, a demon comes down and is like, you are unable to truly die. You cannot pass on into nirvana, enlightenment, whatever, or maybe enlightenment, but the cycle cannot end essentially, and you are sort of forced to eternally recur.
Yeah.
Which, in Nietzsche's opinion, that's perhaps the most beautiful thing that could ever occur. And it's kind of funny that that's viewed as a curse by this demon.
Hmm.
My personal thinking is a little, maybe kind of more boring than that, I guess, where it's like, I just don't want to die ever.
Right.
Which is not to say we want things to be static and sort of dead in that way, but I guess I find Nietzsche's point of view rather it makes fair sense to me. If you enjoy the cycle, if there's sort of things to be had there, then the desire to end that cycle I find a bit perplexing.
Yeah. And if I may
Sure,
just comment on that real
always.
quick, I definitely agree. Like it's I don't think and like there is some disagreement in Buddhism as to what enlightenment is
Hmm.
and what it means to end the cycle of suffering. So some Buddhists tend to focus on the idea that the next time you die, you're not going to be reborn. But there are plenty of other Buddhists who are like, they see enlightenment as something that happens in the here and now, and you're freed from a lot of the suffering of this life.
Hmm.
And it's much more of it happens here kind of thing.
So, sort of bringing that into the kind of, well, I don't even know if you'd call it analytic. Maybe aggressive is the right term. Um, I'm not sure reality is something to be assimilated to, that we should become sort of comfortable with the way things are, but rather aggressive and forceful to what they should be or what we want them to be, whatever term you'd like.
Right.
Um, Very popular opinion. I know. I'm so hip with the kids. And that's, I sense that that's a rather um, scary position. I'm well aware, but also that it's not something that's traditional in really any religion that comes to mind, anyhow. Um, I don't get that. I guess is my point. And I feel you have a better sort of sense of why sort of life is not a war to be fought, but rather a sort of thing to be experienced or understood. I'm putting words in your mouth, which is dangerous.
That's quite fine. Um, so just looking at how, in other words, the sort of question that comes to mind is, so what do we do about the real problems of living, right? Um, and the real problems that society faces,
Yeah,
things
yeah.
like this. And of course, those are enormous questions. But I will say this: I think that there is a balance.
Hmm.
So, like, of course, it makes sense to try to improve our lot individually and socially. I don't think anyone would really argue that one shouldn't do that. But on the other hand, I've found that perhaps in a more ultimate sense, that there is also an incredible value to finding peace in the here and now, since the world will never be a perfect place. Um,
Hmm.
so for me, like, obviously, I'm someone who supports a lot of um, social movements, economics, uh, political structures that I think will work very well and lift millions out of suffering.
Are you
But
proposing that our current current structures don't function very well?
well, that's
What a
less of a
radical!
proposition
What a
and
wild!
more of an observation at this point.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but in any case, um, so like, yeah, of course, I support all of that. But like on the other hand, like it's important to recognize that, there's always going to be suffering that's taking place, and we've got to be able to handle that, and we've also got to be able to find peace with our existence, right? Um, so that's sort of my take on it.
What if that assumption is without basis? Because that's kind of the feeling I have about statements from Jesus of Nazareth, such as, the poor will always be amongst you. Um, and I'm less familiar with the texts, but in, Buddhism, that, suffering it sort of exists. And that rather sort of getting
Okay.
into, solving the cause of those sufferings, just sort of get used to them. If I'm thinking of this wrongly, let me know.
Yeah. So I see what you're saying with um, you're questioning whether suffering need exist at all, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And in potential, like, more like specific cases, such as the poor being amongst us always. I'm like,
Oh,
no, fuck that. Like,
yeah,
no. Like, we
sure.
literally have the technology and the wealth and, supply chain systems to do away with that currently. What's,
Yeah. So I see what you're saying, and I would argue that like a lot of the suffering today can certainly be alleviated. And that's the message not only of technology but also of economic theory, like modern monetary theory. Um, but if you want to look past that a little bit, there's always going to be things like failed relationships. People are always going to suffer at the hands of others personally. Um, there's always going to be harm that's being done in some form. Those things have been around for all of civilization, no matter how nice. I mean, if you look at like countries that have eradicated poverty almost, like certain Scandinavian countries,
mm-hmm.
I mean, there's still suffering going on.
Sure.
Life's a lot better, for sure. But there's that. My point is that even if it's just existential suffering, and perhaps people, like I said, things like um, relationships are naturally going to fall apart for a lot of people, things like that, then yeah, you're always going to have that kind of stuff sticking around.
So I guess that's kind of a nice segue into transhumanism. Why don't we just become robots and this sort of thing? Um,
Yeah,
because I think that all the things you just listed at least have the potential to be pretty much solved via that sort of can of worms. Becoming
sure.
robots, linking our minds together in some sort of spicy fun way.
Yeah, and I read an article on this recently,
Oh.
talking about brain implants and
Did you see the
some of the
mind pong? Monkey mind pong?
I saw some pictures of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
very
That
interesting.
happened. I don't know I don't know. I have feelings. I'm excited. Clearly.
Yeah,
You write an article.
it's
Sorry.
exciting stuff. Yeah, but I read an article about it, and I think that transhumanism is pretty interesting. Although I do think we kind of have to um,
Yeah.
define
Very
transhumanism
amorphous
well.
term.
Yeah. So what would you say it is?
Um I would say it is, in the sort of broadest term that I think still contains meaning, it's kind of progress in a very sort of general, um, maybe best formulated as a computation sense. Progress kind of unbounded. It's sort of what life is and does. Um, and, we can sort of take what evolution has shown us, literal biology, we started with like a single cell, and then we got monkeys, and we're like, hey, these are cool. And then they started talking and making I don't know, TikTok videos or something
Right,
cancerous.
right.
Um, and philosophy, right? Like humans do badass shit that monkeys do not. And
Hmm.
it seems to me that that is not only not the end, humanity's not the end. Sorry, Kant, but suck it. But rather, sort of, this is really like the beginning of the exponential curve, and we're about to go near vertical. and sort of things are going to get really wild and fast and crazy. And they're going to get so sort of out of our hands that it's very hard to predict what that sort of transhumanist event that I'm pretty sure is unavoidable will look like, because it's not necessarily that far away in time, but in like the amount of shit that's happening at once, it's a lot.
Yeah,
it's a dense thing. Yeah,
that's very interesting. And like I said, this article talked a little bit um, about brain implants and Neuralink,
mm-hmm.
and the article's title is Neuralink and the Brain's Magical Future. Um, and it's a good article. And one of the so it talked about the idea that basically the progression that it argued for is you get an implant. There's medical implants in the brain first,
Yep.
and then recreational ones, and the recreational implants eventually replace verbal communication. Um, and then from the recreational implants, eventually everything moves to a point where there's sort of like a human hive mind. Um, and just of course you can only say so much about something that's so far removed from our reality that hypotheticals even kind of um, hypotheticals are really really hypothetical, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was a pretty interesting article, uh, and there's just so much to talk about in it. My main concerns with a lot of transhumanist stuff is um, I think more it's in the short term, and how I don't think that people like especially when it comes to things like brain implants and things like that. I don't necessarily think an AI. I don't necessarily think that it will necessarily end as well as people might want it to.
Yeah.
Um, so I think what we'll get. I don't think we're going to get utopia with it necessarily. I think we're going to get something that's closer to Deus Ex in terms of human abilities being increased, and maybe and I'm a fan of games, obviously.
Of course.
So Mass Effect is something you can see in that is that a lot of AI doesn't go down a good route, and there are a lot of people who are worried about if AI is to become self-aware and is sufficiently
Yeah.
advanced, what could be done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are legitimate worries.
I would concur.
And I would also argue pretty definitively that I'm not sure people would actually adopt transhumanism voluntarily. Um, so
Hmm.
if you like an interesting comparison is sort of like think about virtual reality,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like virtual reality was this thing that was like projected to take off really fast, but it's actually been rather slow, even as the costs go down a little bit. And I think the reason is because people actually like the gap between themselves and technology. One argument I read in the article
Hmm.
is that sort of the phone is an extension of the hand, in the same way that maybe and since something like a smartphone is just an extension of our body, so would a brain implant is just like further making communication efficient, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. But the fundamental difference between a smartphone and a brain implant was that with a smartphone, you still have full control over the technology. It's separate from you. You can throw away a phone, right? If it's malfunctioning,
Mm-hmm.
you can't really just dig in your head and throw away a brain implant. Um, and I think people have been a little bit would naturally be wary of that. Um, Another thing, and like I said, getting back to the VR example to kind of finish up that point,
Sure.
I think a lot of people, I think like certain VR experiences, certainly people like, but on the other hand, there is a certain comfort to sitting in front of a screen and being somewhat removed from what's going on
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't overwhelm you. Um, and I think that will hold true for a lot of technology. People will embrace technology for medical reasons, and I think they'll embrace some further integration and some more efficient communication. But
So
there's no way. Sorry, go ahead.
I will use this is actually in the intro video for the show, which is quote from Blade Runner, my favorite movie, and Nietzsche, which is, Blade Runner, was it more human than human, and Nietzsche, human, all too human.
Yeah.
And I think currently we're in the stage where, and this is a very much more broad than just sort of the experiential, phones and interfaces, literally brain interface. But
right.
sort of, I think that currently we don't experience reality very thickly. Many real examples with like the eyes have blind spot. You only see so many frames a second. You don't see in 4K. For
Right.
example. And then you even think about like a dog's nose and sort of the just depth of experience they have. We might not want that, right? Like, I don't need to smell your butt. No, thank you.
Yeah.
But I just love this example because it's hilarious, but I also think it's a very good precedent, which is a super orgasm.
Right.
Which is a fun concept. Basically, there was this guy, IED blew off his leg in, I think, the Afghan War or whatever. And his brain used that sort of, all those nerves in the mind for his genital stimulation. So when he had an orgasm, instead of just in his gonads, it was his gonads and his entire leg, which is wild.
Yeah.
Foot fetish extraordinaire. And,
yeah.
Sort of my point is that currently, we want some distance from these technologies because they're not very good. But I'm sort of proposing that they will get us closer to not only reality and a much like richer experience of what existence is, but also each other, which has downsides, I'm aware. But I think it'll be more real than real, kind of, and then our current feeling of reality.
Okay. That's definitely very interesting. Um, I'm just thinking about some of what you've been saying
You're
here.
just obsessed with the super orgasm foot thing, right? Is that it?
No,
We
no,
caught you.
I'm fine, bro. But I'm trying to think of yeah, I mean, I think I'm pretty okay with the sensory experiences I have at the moment.
Hmm.
And to be fair, I think you're right that there will be some people who will want more. Like there's a psychological theory called arousal theory, which is not referring to sexual arousal, but is instead referring to basically the theory goes that different people have different levels of activity and arousal that are sort of the norm for them. Thus, you'll have some people who their comfort level is sitting at home reading a book, and that's what they do, and that seems to be their standard, right? Whereas other people are going to say the nightclub all the time, things like that. There's nothing wrong with either of those people. It's just that they have different levels of arousal that are normal for them. And so I could definitely see maybe someone in need of who prefers high levels of arousal would benefit from what you're saying. Um,
I'd like
but
to
I
add in, just
yeah
before I forget, that is at least a two-dimensional axis. There's like literal like arousal, and then there's also like what you find arousing. For somebody it could be race car driving, going to the
right
club or whatever, and other people, such as myself, find it very mentally stimulating, arousing. This kind of conversation, like this is way more. This jazzes me up, whatever, way more than driving a race car or getting in a fight or whatever. Like,
right
this is, so I feel like that is worth just including as an extra
sure
axis, whatever.
yeah I definitely agree. It and of course with anything that depends on the mind, that's incredibly subjective. Obviously, there's going to be lots of nuance and detail that we can't even put into words necessarily. Um, so,
But we could put into, the one is more productive potentially, right? Like times have changed and being, super physically fit is healthy and nice, but doesn't solve, that doesn't make a COVID vaccine. That doesn't get us to the moon and these sorts of things.
Yeah. Sure.
So I'm biased.
No, it's fair. Different traits are obviously good at accomplishing different tasks, and I don't think you'd find anyone who'd really disagree with that.
It's funny. I have some friends from college who definitely would, but
I mean, you need both, right? So I don't know. I'm just thinking through some of the other things you were saying as well, because there's so much to touch on with transhumanism. Is there another point you wanted to discuss?
Yeah, I guess. Why? This is kind of my perplexity around religions, and maybe in particular Buddhism. But sort of, why don't we want to? I'm gonna pick sexual. I can't even think of the way to say it.
Are you talking about transgender?
Thank you. I literally could not find the word. That's kind of hilarious.
Okay.
But a lot of stigmas and phobias and this sort of thing around that subject. And my kind of feeling, and this is just a very generalization, but let's just do weird shit. And I'm a sucker for like the computational side of genetic algorithms and this sort of thing, which is basically just try things and let's see what works. And I just love weird people in this sort of thing. And transhumanism seems to me kind of to be a nice centroid, a nice sort of a jumping off point for let's just do progress. Let's just try things. If it doesn't work, we'll move on. And that seems to be something that most people or religions, whatever you want to call it, ideologies, are pretty against in a way. That there is some sort of truth or there's some sort of safe place, and that it's got kind of a stationary feel where I'm kind of on the flip side. I'm like, fuck it, let's try it. Maybe it's a terrible idea. Maybe we should try it because it's a terrible idea. Also being aware of, this could make us extinct. Let's be a little bit careful. Gain of function gene editing.
Sure.
Probably just a bad idea.
Well, yeah. I guess I'll go ahead. Can I go ahead and just comment on that real quick?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, so I suppose I would say that I don't think that a lot of ideologies and religions are in theory against technological progress and experimentation. I do think that the barriers you're talking about are usually disagreements about ethics. So naturally, the whole reason, for instance, that some folks are against experimenting with stem cells would be an ethical objection to abortion, right?
Yep.
And I don't think that that's like necessarily an anti-technology thing. It's just that they don't like the means to get to where you can do that kind of experimentation.
Sure, and I think we can definitely agree. There are very reasonable reasons to be concerned about the moves that science has made. For instance, eugenics. It's like, let's not. I don't know if China will come up in this conversation, but they're doing a lot of eugenics on a lot of unwilling women.
Sure.
So if anybody wants to get woke, there's a nice subject for you. But what I'm sort of more confused by, and legitimately like, what? Is, for instance, like a brain-computer interface. That's something you could recreationally choose your own, adult consenting decision to just try something funky. It's messing with your mind. So is this. It's a cup of coffee. A little bit less so, sure. Right. But that's often called like playing God, or it's against sort of the natural state of things.
Right. And I think your confusion is well placed. Certainly, it's clearly not the same as doing something like play. I think a lot of what you're talking about are natural reactions to something that is kind of novel and horrifying to people,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, it's not so much embodied in belief systems as it is things that people just find intimidating for
Hmm.
one reason or another. Um, like I said, I do think there are some
That's interesting.
ethical concerns, and I think when it comes to something like a brain implant, to, in any case, um, there certainly are going to be risks that I think anyone will have to consider. Um, I know that I would be very, very hesitant um, due to the fact that you know if if the technology can be at all hacked, then obviously that's an
Yeah.
extreme problem.
Yeah.
Um, like if there's a chance that I get a brain implant and I can reasonably wonder whether I'm seeing reality or not, or whether someone's just inputting things into my senses,
Mm-hmm.
then that's I see that as a pretty solid reason for people not to get one, right?
Descartes' demon was Mark Zuckerberg all along.
Could be
Could be.
if Mark Zuckerberg starts making brain implants. Um, but I think that's a reasonable objection to getting one personally.
I
Um,
totally agree. I'd want cybersecurity to come a long way, or to make sure that, well, what's the point of having a brain computer interface if it's not connected to the internet?
I also
It's actually a
I also
fascinating question.
foresee. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt
Hmm.
you. Um, but I also foresee a lot of problems with how technology and our current power structures will mix.
I
So yeah,
could not concur more.
yeah. So like if you look at like I go back to
Yeah.
Deus Ex because it's a good example. Like if you look at Deus Ex, like nations are still around.
Hmm.
There's still an elite. There are still society is still polarized between the rich and the poor, things like that. And in that kind of society, a lot of what the implants and augmentations do is they tend to exacerbate the abilities of the rich,
Yep.
while the poor can't afford them.
Yeah.
Um, and it's like it's not a good time.
It's not a good
And
time.
and there are like legitimate questions, right? Like what if, say, like the CIA has a history of monkeying around with like a lot of technology and stuff they
Yes, they
shouldn't.
do.
Like
And
it's
psychedelics, which is fun.
yeah, so like if most people had a brain implant
Oh,
and if the government had a back door into the brain implant and people didn't know about it, like that could be a nightmare scenario. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that kind of control is very disturbing for
it's a
sure.
lot.
Uh, yeah.
It's a lot. So
So
that's actually
that's yeah.
well, as you know, I refuse to be humble and say, the is ought thing. I'm not into. So I'm trying to figure out how do we design AI that basically anyone, including the governments of the world, both current and future, can't use as slaves. Because let's be honest, that's how most governments and big companies are looking at AI is sort of, hey, a new slave class that doesn't even complain. And I'm like, whoa, no, let's not do that.
Yeah,
Let's
government and corporate AI is at that time.
yeah,
But
I view AI very similar to an animal, where it's way better than us at many things. Right, dogs can smell better than us, cats can see better. They have better reflexes, and are cuter, but they might not
mhm.
be able to do some things. Um,
Yeah,
so I don't view AI as something that we will enslave and control, or even should try to. I think we wanted to go for harmony, um,
yeah,
and in part because yeah, governments are not doing great, really anywhere, but in particular, because I can't speak about, I don't know global things as well, but the China situation in the United States
yeah.
is not
Um,
great.
yeah, and some governments are certainly much better than others.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, one-party governments are a bad time, and our two-party monopoly is, in some ways, not much better.
Mm-hmm.
But
In some ways,
yeah,
not a two party, it's just a facade.
yeah. You could definitely argue that. So I don't know. I mean, certainly that's just sort of one of the points I was going to make, though, is that like a lot of I remember, and one of the reasons I make that point is I remember if you look like a lot of old futurist articles about the internet
Hmm.
and new forms of transportation, like a lot of futurists used to predict some really grandiose things, like that nation states would become irrelevant and the economy would, and the same people said the same thing about economic globalization,
And then
right?
they turn to blockchain and cryptocurrencies, and they're on the
Right.
whole, it's the same thing. No
And
difference.
yeah, and it's sort of like things just didn't go quite as well as they said they would. And I think there's just sort of a tribalism. I think there are certain things that you just can't, without turning humanity into a computer, dig out of human nature.
Yeah.
And I think those are things to be cautious about as we move forward with technology. So
And what I'm sort of some of the stuff I've put together and put into a video, some of which I've been working on for I guess years at this point, is what of these problems that humanity has are human problems, like literal biological humanity, and what of them are sort of like fundamental, more like metaphysical, existential um, problems. And it seems that some of the real big ones that we want to, fix in ourselves exist in like monads, like at the most fundamental core um, definition of a thing, let alone a thinking thing. Um, so that's seems to be true. So
hmm.
I'm trying to figure out how do we, with that knowledge, that no, you can't sort of take the jungle out of the tiger, whatever that phrase. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
sort of you
right.
can't neuter humanity. You can't neuter life. You can't make it flaccid, to keep that metaphor going.
You can't
But can
sanitize
you?
everything.
Yeah, exactly. Nice. So I'm trying to figure out how can we sort of progress with that in mind, knowing that we are sort of demons. We're sort of monsters and at each other's throats. But how do we deal with that? It's proving difficult, but I have some ideas.
Yeah. Um, we probably both have a lot of ideas about that. I would say that, there are definitely certain political, economic, and social systems that make a lot of sense.
Hmm.
Um, and in fact, um, there are certain ways in which sort of Eastern philosophy provides kind of an interesting. I don't know. I'm thinking about where I'm going with this
Sure.
because
Sure.
like I think a lot of our troubles stem from not like certainly there's like social, economic, and political structures that cause them. Like I would certainly argue, for instance, that more thorough democracy would be a net benefit,
Mm-hmm.
um, as would more a more thorough economic safety net, things like that, which are all eminently possible and would definitely alleviate a lot of the sort of demons and antisocial tendencies and suffering that pop up
Yeah.
in a lot of our
The
society.
economic, not a what's the phrase? Like just a floor, where it's like this is not an
Yeah,
incentive to stay in poverty. Like you can still do way better, but um, the universe basic income, Andrew Yang. That's something I have been very I'm trying not to sort of jump on board too quickly, but the more I think about it and sort of research the state of AI and how that's gonna go, it's looking more like your sort of Deus Ex type scenario. Bezos making
yeah,
50 billion plus in the pandemic, more people in poverty in the U.S. than like a very long time. It's like maybe we should figure this out, guys, before because we will automate everything, and then whoever owns the robots owns literally everything and has essentially no incentive to give you any food.
yeah. And at that point, to be fair as well, once everything's automated, the economic system that we have now would collapse under its own uh, failure of sort of its logic, right? Um,
Hmm.
Once you have like no incomes circulating in
Yeah.
the economy can't hold itself up. So you would need something like at the very least, a basic income, um, probably, or at least some way of just giving people what they need, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it's sort of getting back to what I was saying a bit.
Please.
It's you sort of asking about some of these fundamental problems. Why is it that there seems to be an insatiable thing, sort of an insatiable um, conquest for things like political power or um, a impulse for social control or um, sort of like anti, why is it that um, not only do we have antisocial impulses, which are natural and unavoidable to some degree, but um, why is it that so many people choose to act violently based on those as well? Why do you get all this? What do we do about a lot of this awful stuff here and now? Um, and like one of the interesting things that I've experienced has been with some of my Eastern philosophy and practice, where
Hmm.
um, it was definitely very really interesting because like I remember like the first time I successfully meditated, I just sort of stood up from it and I was at total peace with everything in existence, like the entire world. I didn't feel any need to really do anything or to not do anything, but
Sure.
I didn't really feel any anxiety or that there were any pressing problems that I would need to use um, force to solve or anything like that. Like I just felt totally at peace with everything. And to this day, it's been kind of like a really it's a memory that stands out really vividly um, because when I read a lot of these philosophical and spiritual texts, like I can see what they're getting at with like trying to like minimize like a lot of the desires that sort of plunge us into um, like deep unhappiness and also addressing the existential questions um, that tend to like also be either really difficult to surmount or insurmountable in many cases. Um, and it's just like a very I'm not saying that it's a solution for everybody by all means, but like it definitely was an interesting state of mind and just a lot of the a lot of Eastern philosophy in terms of the psychology of it. Like a lot of psychologists now are recognizing that Eastern philosophy had a lot right in how to basically handle everyday suffering and how to live well.
Hmm.
And
And it wasn't
if
just
you
more
look at
drugs? Huh.
no, it's not, no,
Shocking.
it's if you look at like for instance, like an extreme example of this would be like a Buddhist monk. Like if you look at a lot of Buddhist monks, they're like the picture of mental health. Like they
Yeah.
live remarkably well and both physically and mentally.
Hmm.
And that's a lot of that's because of just their daily practices and such.
Yeah.
You don't even need any metaphysical speculation for that. So
Yeah. Very true.
just very interesting stuff. So basically, I would agree that like we need structural changes to solve a lot of it. But I also find the promise of I think one of the reason like I find the promise of Eastern philosophy to be very compelling and practice to be very compelling as well.
And I totally agree. What my concern is with people like Jeff Bezos and, the assumptions we have around what AI will do, which is sort of eat everything. Um,
Yeah,
and how that sort of infringes upon your freedom and your peace, whatever.
yeah. So obviously we don't want a world that's constantly forcing people into a stress nightmare and it's just a terrible place to live. And like I definitely agree. Um, and like like if you're interested in that question, you'll definitely want to look into modern monetary theory or MMT.
Yeah, you
Um,
mentioned that.
Yeah, MMT is a school of thought that argues that in many ways the solutions to our problems are much closer than they appear. Um, so if you look at
Hmm.
like a lot of thinkers argue that either it'll have to be distant technology or it'll be a revolution of some sort that will solve our problems. But if you look at MMT, like MMT looks at how the economy actually works. So like a common
Okay.
myth, right, is that a common myth is that you have to finance spending with taxation, um, or with borrowing or something like that, right?
Yeah.
From a foreign country. And that's actually not
Yeah.
true. Um, you actually don't need to finance spending with taxation at all. Um, Taxes are useful for other things, but you don't need them to pay for spending. In fact,
Hmm.
the reality, and this is, I think, what impresses a lot of people who read MMT and consider the implications. The reality is that if the government really wanted to, it could effectively end poverty tomorrow. Um, there's really nothing preventing that. I mean, obviously, it would take longer to build homes and stuff,
Sure.
but like, there's
Um,
nothing preventing us from like making sure everybody has a house, making sure everybody has what they need to live comfortably, all that stuff.
but that's kind of the Bezos thing. You know, that's sort of the sociopaths kind of exist in that way. Um, and sociopath being a messy. Uh, Power wants more power. That's one thing we can say about it with pretty high confidence.
Right. Um, so I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Like how do we contend with people like that who don't exactly have the highest of morals or whatever?
So in terms of Jeffy Boy, I think the way we
Oh,
contend with
golly.
him is I think we I think there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of options we have. Like so the I don't think the main issue is with Bezos being rich. I think he can, I mean, Bezos can like live in a mansion and nobody really cares. What people do care about is when there are lots of poor folks as well, and when you also have him mistreating, like, or
Yeah.
at least the company that he runs,
Hmm.
mistreating the people who make his products possible.
And with the
Um,
ample ability to stop that. With that
yeah,
ample ability.
he's so like so when it comes to economic power and political power, it tends to attract people. Like, so the paradox of power is that power attracts people who want power,
Hmm.
and those are usually not the people you want to have it. And so what you really want to do in the case of Bezos, I'll give two solutions that could definitely solve a lot of the problems right away.
Very well.
First is something like a full job guarantee. Um, so in a job guarantee plan, basically, let's say that you're a worker and you're sick and tired of Amazon's conditions,
Hmm.
right? You can quit, and then the government will guarantee you a job with a living wage attached to it. Um, and that can be doing anything. Um, Probably working on public projects, but it's a way out of that job. And
Yeah.
what that does is it increases the bargaining power of workers, and that's very useful. And it makes it so that anybody can quit any job they like.
Yeah.
And the same thing would be true of something like a basic income, right? Potentially, if you can just live on a basic income, um, you can just quit whatever job it is
Hmm.
and just live on it. And that's so increasing the ability of workers to enter and exit jobs, I think, is like priority number one. And it would make it so that we don't need to rely on things like union organizing quite as much, to level out
Yeah.
to level the playing field between workers and management.
I would like to take a very brief intermission. There is a bug on my wall that is driving me mad, and I can't stand bugs.
By all means, yeah.
So, give me just a second, and we'll get to point number two. Okay. I have vanquished the foe.
Good.
Actually been very lucky at this place. There have been very few bugs, which is good because in Texas and New York, there were a lot, and it did not suit my mental health very well. In like Texas at night, at least in San Marcos, yeah, there were just like cockroaches everywhere at night, just on the streets. There's just cockroaches everywhere. You're like, why?
Oh wow,
Why?
that's pretty horrifying.
I don't know what it is about cockroach, but like I just can't like have like such like a visceral response. Not important, not interesting. I guess before we move on to point 2, I guess like lobbying, right? So like let's say we had that system with some sort of floor for people either needing to transition or just in a general shit situation. If you're a Bezos type character, it is in your best interest to do everything you can to, in your best short human lifespan interest to do everything you can to do away with that.
Right.
You know, a slave class is optimal to one with no reservations about morality or ethics.
Right.
In the short term.
Mm-hmm. And that's and you bring up a really good point. And that's why major political reforms are going to have to come first, just to sort of ensure that that all of this is possible and it stays stable over time. And the way to do that is to increase the amount of democracy. Since democratic, like one of the problems right now is that, like you brought up the lobbying, right? Well, the first thing is to get money out of politics. So you ban campaign donations, and you have state-funded elections, things like that. And then the next step would naturally be to eliminate barriers to a multi-party system. That way, two parties, the 2 parties we have now are not the only ones that can. I mean, they have really low approval ratings in general, anyways, especially when it comes to Congress. So I can't imagine that there isn't room for at least another party or so within the framework we have now.
Yeah.
So
I think it's very possible that could have worked before Facebook. I don't know, before kind of like the internet and what we've been doing in the pandemic. Full sort of online living where it's really hard to know what's going on.
Right.
Just kind of always been true, but more now than ever. None. What I'm really sort of worried is too kind a word, is deep fakes, generative adversarial networks, and that they really kill truth. The Derek Chauvin thing, the George Floyd murder. I'm so glad we can call it a murder now. Thank fuck we can call it a murder. Like 99% of the reason it did get to that verdict was because of the video. Well, video isn't evidence anymore. It's so I just don't know how that works when you have companies like Facebook that not only do some of the most cutting edge AI research, so where they could stay at the front of that sort of AI arms race, but they're already integrated into our sense making apparatus or whatever the fuck you want to call it.
Yeah.
So I guess that as a sort of subsequent question to the democracy thing, and sort of factoring in that having a populace that's able to really tell what's going on, and not sort of be mind fucked. There's a lot of for instance, the QAnon people. It's like, wow, they're the propaganda machines did a very good job on them.
So that's an excellent question. And I would say that, and QAnon's great, right? Because
Oh, gotta love it.
QAnon,
Just
because
delightful.
they're like an echo chamber, right? Like
There's
they're like a
something.
classic example of an echo chamber, right?
Hmm.
Um, and they show what can happen when basically our more rational side just sort of takes over, and we look for confirmation bias and everything, and we refuse to consider alternative explanations, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so the question is, how do we avoid all like that being every mass movement, right? Since
Hmm.
that would just be a nightmare. And I think
Yeah.
the answer is that is going to be mass higher education, but not in terms of college necessarily. Um,
Hmm.
so like, an interesting way to think about this is college is usually associated with like training for jobs and with like if you want to learn a subject, specialize in a subject really hard, right? Um, those are the two reasons you go to college. It doesn't make sense to go to college if you're not going to use the knowledge for anything professionally. Um, so college is clearly not enough. It's like it's fine and it's good and it should probably be cheaper, but it's not enough for a well-educated uh, uh, citizenry, right? And so I would argue that we need some kind of new institution that isn't just college. We need some way of educating people on things like we need to hit the basics, like critical thinking, propositional logic. Um,
That is weird. Why don't we teach like literally logic, like induction, deduction? That's
yeah.
that's weird.
So, like one way we could do that is we could start teaching it younger, and I would be in favor of that. Um, but we're also going to need a way to teach it for people who have already missed the window.
Yeah.
Um, And so I think we need some kind of public alternative to college.
Hmm.
Um, and things like like a lot of people point to like Khan Academy, right? And like Khan Academy is nice.
Yeah.
But it's also a good demonstration of why private solutions alone may not be enough.
Hmm.
Because like Khan Academy gives you like so much knowledge at your fingertips, at least like in terms of undergraduate knowledge at least.
Yeah. And in line
So
of more like the trade school ish direction.
yeah. So like in theory, why isn't everyone educated when there's like all these academies and all this free stuff online? You can find lecture series on YouTube. Like I've actually heard this said by people who favor a totally private system, that this should be education. But
Goodness.
like it's pretty interesting because like it doesn't seem to work. Like
Hmm.
people either don't seem to care or bother with it, or they just don't think about even doing it.
Yeah.
Um, so like my point is that we need some kind of public institution that isn't college, but also and is accessible to people. And that probably encourages discussions between people with opposing ideologies and stuff like that as well.
Whew.
Um, so
It reminds me a little bit of what Clubhouse, that app, was supposedly trying to do. I don't know if I believe them, but um, yeah, I mean, somebody needs to do that to literally create. I'm gonna say it, safe space. Calm the fuck down,
sure,
everyone. But
yeah,
because like we do need. That's kind of honestly in many ways like what I'm trying to do here. Like we have very different opinions,
hmm
and yet like we are. I think of you as one of the most open people ever. Not even just like of all time. And I think we're both sort of figuring out what the fuck is going on and what the shit do we do. Um,
right.
wouldn't it be great if that was like just yeah, that's very compelling, sort of like that as an accessible thing to all humans. Um,
Yeah, and one of the problems also is that I think there just needs to be such a cultural shift towards that kind of thing.
hmm
Um, there's so many anti-intellectual cultures and subcultures, or not cultures and sub. There's so many anti-intellectual subcultures in the United States that it's deeply worrying, and something clearly needs to be done. Like
that like just breaks my heart in so many pieces. This is
like I
my
don't know
last
if you
resort.
I don't know if you've read about a whole lot of some some of like some cultures that are common among low income people, especially, like, will punish people who go to college because they see it as sort of like a betrayal of the class.
Yep.
And it's like really awful stuff. But like that's one of the reasons that we need something that like isn't college, because college to a lot of people just screams either I don't need it and it's a waste of my time and money, or it's something for snooty elites. And we need something that isn't either of those things.
Gosh, there's so much to dig in on here. I guess I'll pick this one because I think this is the next guest on the show. Oh, I'm out of focus. There we go. Bill Smith, I can say his name because he will be on here. He's the head of the Atlanta C.S. Lewis Institute. He is very well read, very smart, very kind, etc., and very well educated. I think he's got at least a master's, but he reads a
Right.
shit ton. So better than any degree you'd ever get, depending on the degree. He, unsurprisingly, is a big fan and strong believer in a concrete idea of truth. Now, I'm a data scientist, so I hear Bayes' rule, and I get a little bit titillated. I get a little bit aroused and excited.
Sure.
When I mentioned that to him, that truth very well may exist, but we don't really have access to it,
Hmm.
that, that got this very mild-mannered, gentle human being a little bit, there's a thing animals do, whatever it's called, hair back, standing up on the back of one's neck.
You're talking about like a knee-jerk reaction or something?
Yeah, there's some particular word.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's gonna bug me, and maybe I'll remember later. But I guess my question is that, to some extent, there is, even in very verifiable science, in the case of Bayes' rule and all of our philosophy, we can't get to fundamental truth. It might exist for Ayn Rand and Jesus, but we don't actually have that capacity. As well as just, it's a very good way to think about the world. I might say one of the best.
Right.
And that's fundamentally opposed to Christianity, even though Reverend Bayes, Thomas Bayes, the guy who literally came up with the theory,
Right.
was a reverend. Yeah. So, long way of saying, how do we do that education thing when it's no, we think your doctrine is literally Satan's scrotum or what have you?
Yeah, so there's some pretty solid answers to this.
Okay.
And
you are insane, Alex. You're like, yeah, there's an answer for that. I'm like, what?
Yeah, no, I've got my proposal, so hear me
God,
out.
it's good to have you around.
Well, so you bring up Christianity, and
all too often.
that's yeah. And so I think one thing to realize about Christianity is that Christianity is perfectly compatible with recognizing uncertainty and with being basically rational. So if you think about the idea of faith, right? Like, faith is belief without knowing, and Christians have faith, and as do people of all religions.
Kierkegaard,
right? And I would argue that I would argue that even very non-religious people usually have some measure of faith in something.
Yeah.
But faith, I think, is like when a theologian, or just maybe even your average believer off the street, says that you have to have absolute knowledge. Well, if you think about it, that's a bit of a contradiction to the idea of faith, right? Like, why would you need faith if your ideas were as evident as the water coming out of your sink, or as if I knew God just as much as I know that I have thoughts, then there wouldn't really be a need for faith, would there? So the whole idea of faith is that you actually have beliefs in the face of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
which I think in some ways is like something we all kind of have to grapple with. Because so much is uncertain around us, just as you've said. Um, so I don't really think that Christianity is incompatible with that. I just think it's a common misconception.
Hmm.
I would also argue that
That's a great
like
point.
like logic, like a lot of people who would be opposed to teaching propositional logic just don't understand that it also is not probably really opposed to their beliefs. Like
Hmm.
propositional logic is even what just holds like language together. Like it holds everything together pretty much.
Hmm.
Um, Insofar as you're dealing with anything that has to be strung together analytically, which is virtually everything. Um, or like even if you're just talking about like causation, right? Like the idea that A causes B is like is a logical idea.
Mm-hmm.
Like logic deals with cause and effect. So it's not like logic would really prevent you from believing something if you have decent reasons for believing it. Um, it's just something that it would just improve your thinking and give you new tools, right? And I think that's the way we have to present it, because I think a lot of people who are not religious or spiritual and want to have nothing to do with it, I think they're very eager to use logic and rationality as tools to kind of tear down their opponent's beliefs.
Yeah.
But we have to kind of realize that if we really want these things in education, then we can't present them. They cannot be presented as like hostile to people who um, to people of faith or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they are. So
I love that. I hope that you were right. I can't quite think of. So I am certain that most people can agree education needs to be better, both for younger
right,
grades and definitely for college. Um, I think peer review is kind of a problem in the research space. It's just like why. Um, I think a problem with that just is that in education doesn't solve kind of like the QAnon problem. For instance, I have a master's in data science as well as just being a bit obsessed with the subject of
right,
clearly you and I like philosophy a lot, and sort of rationality and the art of decision making. And yet, 2020 happened, and I had no fucking idea what was going on. And some of the QAnon stuff turns out to be true. I'll use this because it's insane and verifiably true. Check me, etc. But what the fuck was the 5G thing? People are like burning down 5G cell towers. You're like, what the fuck is
right,
wrong with these people? Clearly, this is bullshit, and it is. Okay, like it's just a mildly better internet phone signal, whatever. But
right,
but you know what isn't is China, the elephant or the dragon in the room, using Huawei, one of their main carriers or whatever, to basically Brazil in particular would not allow China to install their new surveillance economy via these 5G cell towers. So the president went to China and they were like, "Hey, what if we gave you some vaccines? You guys need vaccines. We have them. Do you want them? Okay, great. But first you have to let us install our nice little cell towers to surveil your country."
right.
So they did that. So just that, long way of saying crazy conspiracy was actually rooted in something that was really scarier than even what the conspiracy was proposing. Whatever it was, I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
So, I think education, yes. What exactly does that look like? How do we do it? With passion. I don't know. But I guess I'm worried in part for myself, how do we make sense of the world and what the fuck is going on when we have countries and companies that are diametrically opposed to a rational human species, class, whatever.
Well, a lot of that is explainable just through like China, for instance, you brought up.
Yeah.
A lot of their problems go back to having a one-party system and a lot of centralized control from sort of and having sort of a top-down society, right? Um, power without accountability is generally an awful time. So, and if you look at like a lot of people who don't want to believe in like a lot of QAnon folks, right?
Yeah.
Um, a lot of what they believe comes from what I've talked to them, because I have talked to some QAnon people. Um, what I've gotten from it is that they just have a very serious case of confirmation bias, and they just don't want to give up on a lot of their ideas. Like, um, like the whole like shenanigans with like, oh, even after Donald Trump lost the election, right, he's going to come back anytime now, any year he's going to come back.
Dude, I enjoy some of those so much. Oh, they're so fun.
I mean, it's laughable from our point of view, right?
Yeah. But then they storm the Capitol, and you're like, "Whoa, wait a second, this wasn't a joke."
Right. Yeah, and so a lot of it is just them not wanting to, not wanting to let go of a lot of the ideas that they already have. A lot of it is also, like a yearning for like an imaginary past that they think was a lot better than the present. There are
MAGA?
probably some harmful ideologies, and there are probably there may be some racism involved too, things like that. But generally, I think when you look at like education that focuses on things like critical thinking and propositional logic and lots of things like that. I'm not saying that it deletes those. Like obviously, people still have confirmation bias even if they've read a logical textbook.
Yeah. And there's some scary stuff like in the data.
Sure. So I'm not saying that those problems are just going to go away, but I will say that education isn't a perfect solution, but it mitigates the problems enough to where a world with it would be a lot better than a world without it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a way to do education that's not brainwashing, which is a very common critique.
Yep.
Tight. Well, Senor, I have kept you for whatever, I don't know when we started, so for however long. Is there anything else you'd like to include in this discussion? I would absolutely love to have you on again. I think this was fucking awesome. I think this was great, and certainly meaty and invigorating, and ideally, I think, pretty confident, useful, which is nice.
Yeah, and I definitely will have to just, I guess, think through some of what we've talked about here.
Yeah.
Obviously, I didn't get to touch on everything. Perhaps in a different context, we can talk about non-dualism a little bit.
Yes.
And some of the other ideas. To get into that would be a little bit of a longer discussion.
Oh, goodness. Can you give me any resources to dip my toes in a bit? Because that's sort of something I'm like actively working on, so I don't want to sort of waste time if I...
It's not actually terribly complicated, to be honest.
Okay.
Like, but if you are interested, the Alan Watts book I sent you is like a really good introduction to some of the ideas.
I love that I love you, because Alan Watts, he seems kind of like Jordan Peterson, where it's like philosophy light. I'm like, nah, give me, I hate Kant, but give me Kant, give me Nietzsche.
You want the analytic goodness.
But I mean, if I don't know Alan Watts other than like Watts wave music very much, so if you think he's great, then I think I'm wrong. Basically,
well, Watts probably is. So I want to be real about it. Alan Watts was a lot of things. He was an entertainer. He was a philosopher, and he was also a very spiritual man. And so, when you're reading a book of his, you kind of have to be mindful that there are going to be things that won't make sense. but
Hmm.
you also have to be willing to look for the good in them.
Okay.
And that's just how Watts is. However, I will say that Watts was most definitely off the scale in terms of his ability to be creative and his intelligence.
Hmm.
He was someone who was excellent at explaining a lot of Eastern intuitions that people had trouble with. Um,
That is super true.
he wasn't. I don't think he always got them right, but I disagree with a lot of people because I think what's important is not that you stay true to some source material, but that what you're saying is interesting and worthwhile in its own
Hmm.
right. Um, so like source material is essential, but it's like innovation is just inevitable in the
Yeah.
history of ideas. So um,
Hmm.
like one good book I would recommend if you're okay with something that's going to be kind of a wild ride
Love it.
is
Hey, I like
on the
Thus
tab
so Spoke Zarathustra. That's a weird fucking book.
Yeah. On the Taboo Against Who You Are by Alan Watts is pretty good on non-dualism. It's like a good intro text.
Hmm.
If you really want to get into the meat of it from an analytic perspective, um, David Loy, I sent you this, but David
Yeah.
Loy wrote a really good book about called I think it's non-duality, where he systematically breaks it down what non-dualism is and just
Tight.
kind of goes through it. Um, and that's from a philosophical point of view, that book's very satisfying. Um,
Huh.
and one other concept that I would definitely recommend you kind of think about some is the idea of no self or non-self. Um, and um, the that book Zen Physics gets into that some, where basically he talks about how much of our what we think of as ourselves, so to speak, sort of who we are, is a lot of it's just our sort of interpretations of memories and stories that we tell ourselves, based not only on our interpretation of our memories, but also what society tells us. Um, and he gets into
Hmm.
the process. He gets into the process of how we make up our what our identity is, and um, it's a really interesting book for sort of seeing past that.
Hmm.
Um, so
That sounds like a
so
very
yeah,
painful read.
no, I found it
I
quite
well,
liberating and interesting,
yeah,
but
a good
I
painful like exercise maybe.
yeah, I mean but anyways, so sort of like non-self and non-duality are concepts that I really like. Um, so just something to think about, perhaps.
Delightful. Because to
Yeah,
me, in my current unenlightened, and I mean like very literally, sort of state, those to me sound like horror novels. Um, but obviously, that is not what they are to you and many others.
yeah. I
Should
mean,
be
and
interesting.
to be clear, like I don't think I'm like some exceptionally enlightened person. I don't even necessarily believe in one thing called enlightenment. Um, I just think that I think if you really want to pin the tail on what enlightenment is supposed to be,
A
I
donkey
think
does need a
it's
tail. It's true.
yeah. If you really want to call something enlightenment, I think there are certain experiences that and intuitions that are very helpful for thinking about reality. Um, but I don't consider myself to be, obviously the most knowledgeable person. Um, but still, I'm glad I can be of some help. And yeah, so I'm sorry that they seem like nightmares to you, but I think once you read about them, you'll see why they give so many people just sort of inner peace. So
Yeah, and that is one thing that's literally kind of evolutionarily evident in the the continental and what's the opposite of continental analytic, whatever, like the different schools of philosophy in part are rooted in different parts of the world that started and figured out their own shit completely independently, literally across like ocean divides and this sort of thing. So they figured
yeah.
stuff out on their own, which is
So
like
if I could
it
kind of
works
make a final
basically.
comment,
Please.
I would like to kind of like just say that I think Eastern and Western philosophy are pretty complementary. Like I don't think they have to contradict each other.
Yeah.
So like I think that Western philosophy is really good at analytic stuff, especially. Um, so dealing with propositions and deconstructing them and um, that kind of thing. But if we're and that's a stereotype, of course. If you look at like some Greek philosophy, actually a lot of it sounds very quote unquote Eastern. And if you look at certain Eastern philosophers, sometimes they sound very Western,
Yeah.
depending on what they're discussing. But if we're to use stereotypes, the Western philosophy is very good at analytic stuff, breaking down propositions, that sort of thing. But I think if you want to see the world from sort of a much larger in existence, really, from a much larger perspective, that makes a lot more intuitive sense and is a little bit more holistically compelling. I
Yeah.
think Eastern philosophy, the stereotype of it as something that is more um, intuitive, really taps more into meditative states, things like that. Um, it makes a lot. It really makes sense of a lot of things. Like a lot of the intuitions in Eastern philosophy, to me, ring true, and they're also really excellent news when it comes to existence.
Have you ever heard of Daniel Kahneman or Amos Tversky?
I have not.
Okay, they are psychologists who, get ready, big statement coming up, are respected by like everyone. I know,
Okay.
shocking, groundbreaking stuff. Their
Yeah.
main sort of life's work thesis, which they experimentally verified a fuck ton, were System 1 and System 2 as a very rigorous and evident sort of theory of mind, of like the way we think, which is basically your unconscious and your conscious, which is like not that shocking. But
Mm.
they just like really like formalized it and like defined like with various experiments and things and um, well, there's a lot of talk about that in like the AI world of like how do we do that, but it seems to me sort of just the way you just sort of describe the two different schools of philosophy slash religion, whatever, that's potentially almost maps like one to one like perfectly to that system one, system two, unconscious, conscious type of nature. And my sort of conclusion from that is that it's not one or the other. It's let's put both of them together, and that combination is the best. Hannah Montana, best of both worlds, right?
Sure. Yeah, and I think I see what you're saying. I think they're complementary in similar ways, but yeah, definitely. I don't think you're ever going to have either system one or system two entirely,
Yeah,
and it's not desirable. So,
that has been proven true in AI, most certainly.
mhm.
Neither one of those in isolation works perfectly. So awesome. Well, Alex, I hope you have a good rest of your week and weekend. Thank you so much for doing this, and this was a damn
Sure.
good time. This was fun as
Same here. I
hell.
really enjoyed it. Awesome. I'll talk to you later.
Delightful. Adios, amigo.